Evelyn Lau is a Vancouver author of 13 books, including 8 volumes of poetry. Her memoir, Runaway, Diary of a Street Kid, published when she was 18, was made into a CBC movie starring Sandra Oh in her first major role. Evelyn's prose books have been translated into a dozen languages. Her poetry has received the Milton Acorn People's Poetry Award, the Pat Lowther Award for Best Book of Poetry by a Canadian Woman, and a National Magazine Award, as well as nominations for a BC Book Prize and a Governor General's Award. Her poems have been chosen numerous times for inclusion in the Best Canadian Poetry Series, and she has been writer in residence at UBC, Kwantlen College, and Vancouver Community College, as well as distinguished visiting writer at the University of Calgary. From 2011 to 2014, Evelyn served as poet laureate for the city of Vancouver.
My poems are from my new collection, Pineapple Express. And the first poem I'm going to read is called Family Day, because we've just had the Family Day weekend. And Family Day is a Canadian holiday. I don't believe it's an American one, but my interpretation of the holiday may not be something that the government would necessarily put up on their website promoting the holiday, but this is my version of Family Day. Once you lived inside her body, heard its thumps and gurgles, that liquid house sloshing in the dark. Families of ducks squabble on the blue-gray water. You've started twitching the way your mother did in her 40s. Fingers plucking. You're fighting it every day, the black roar of anxiety, skin a pincushion pricked with hives, the fizzes and hiccups of your brain as you lie in bed, insomniac. No one in your family speaks your name. Her drawn face, stretched nerves. But there's medications for that now. In vivid antidepressant dreams, it's all pastels and ice cream, except when it's blood, carcasses, screams. Your neighbor's crying in the hall. I don't know what's worse, the days my mother doesn't recognize me, or the days she does and remembers how much she hates me. At least the weather knows what's what, knows it's a day for relentless rain. No families frolicking under sunny skies in wildflower meadows, no picnics in the park. Once she ran after you and caught you in her trembling white arms. You could smell her, sour milk, yogurt, the space between her thighs. She hated the way you pressed your stomach against the sink while washing dishes. In the teenage bedroom, you measured your doughy thighs and pondered where to cut. Hid Mars bars in the dresser, the desk, under the olive shag rug. Still, you remember plums in the grass, snails, slugs in the backyard, the spider that crawled up your bare leg while you stood stock still, calling for her. It was also Chinese New Year's a few days ago, and this poem, Silk Road. Silk Road is a band, a local band, and the BC writer Janie Chang, who's a friend of mine, invited me to one of their concerts at Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens. So this is the poem that came out of that. Silk Road. Everywhere I look, there's beauty, you say. These days, you are living on the beach, your tent a sad flap of striped orange and yellow, parked near the washrooms. But tonight at Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens, we can forget what we've lost. Pretend we live in the pagoda on the cliff, saffron curtains stirring in the tea-scented breeze. Bottle blue dragonflies stitch the space between our heads, and from a distance, the pipa player's polyester cheongsam resembles the finest silk. Jade and bonsai gnarled in glazed pots, koi flickering in the lotus pond, ginseng painted on hanging scrolls. Suddenly, I want to learn calligraphy, you cry, that frightening light in your eyes. Let's forget our miserly days, the counting out of coins for a handful of squashed kumquats in the reduced shelf at the rear of the grocery store. Let's pretend we're favored concubines swaddled in sumptuous robes while starving artists pluck away at their instruments, caper for our amusement. Tonight, someone else has paid our way. It's interesting being a middle-aged female because, of course, you become invisible, and perhaps to young people, the fact that you had a life as a young person that was perhaps far more dramatic and edgy than the lives they're leading now is lost to them, which is the way it should be. So this poem is about, I guess, becoming invisible. It's called Disturbances. These last wordless days of August, you can't tell if this is joy or despair. Sitting by the window, watching the trees seethe with sparrows. Here and there, the green froth is disturbed by a singe of rust, a lemon leaf swirled into the lime. The berries the birds peck look nut hard, sour as unripe plums. Whatever seeds they yield packed tight inside a red shell like a wax seal. On Sunday night, 3 policemen hammered on your door, hands on their holsters, racing from floor to floor to seek the source of the screaming reported to 911. You answered the door in your middle age, TV flickering on mute, in your nightshirt and slippers at 10 p.m., surely so incapable of causing a disturbance, of exciting a violent passion, that the cops politely averted their eyes and apologized for disturbing your peace. Had they even been born, those years you were disturbing everyone's peace? Now it's another young woman's turn. You returned to your chair by the window, to the mystery in the overgrowth, the welter of green darkness, the trees' oceanic surge and swell in the gusting night. For months, you haven't seen your neighbors, just the strutting crows and the power lines, the rock garden and the generator. Adrian and I have talked about depression, and a number of the poems in this book are about depression. And November is always a difficult month for depressives, and for everyone else as well too. And yet, of course, people who aren't on the West Coast envy our mild temperatures and the fact that our flowers are practically, they start coming up in January. So this from a friend of mine in Alberta who said to me many times that life here is a cakewalk. So this poem is for him. It's called Cakewalk. In November, the bridge whispers to you. Sharpened knives sing. Gutters overflow with leaves and a lake appears in the middle of downtown. Survival depends on finding caches of color, poppies pinned on collars, a pastel umbrella in a sea of black, berries clustered on a sodden bush. Winter here is a cakewalk, says the man from Alberta. And you remember that burning, the torching of lips and ears, your legs raw scarlet hams in the cold. Here is just months of gray. The landscape stainless steel, sterling silver, putty and cement. Sky the slime of shucked oysters. Your eyes water watching CSI Miami and Hawaii Five-0 on television. Grass and trees, a radioactive green, throbbing, birds of paradise, stabs of tropical citrus. Outside, the creek washes over the seawall, deposits of frill, of Q-tips, rubber gloves, used needles stitching the shoreline. The sun, that pale smear low on the horizon. Depression was a challenge to write about because, you want to capture the flatness of mood without making the language flat. So that was something I was navigating throughout this collection. And this is another way of looking at that subject. It's called plunge. Now you are looking up from the bottom of the lake. You are walking past the townhouses in April under the budding trees and drowning. The doctor warned you about this time of year, how you needed to watch the trees, their pale fur coming in. Blink, and that dusk would be smooth green leaves. At the Sylvia bar, the harsh sunlight pressed on your face like a wedge-shaped iron. For the first time in years, everyone was older than you. His hand in his hair, your hand in yours. Later, the seaweed trees overhead, swaying, your bodies bumping together on the seawall. Sunset, a bronze bar, waited on the horizon, blinding. Forget the pink starfish, the flotilla of harlequin ducks, the geese honking across the massed sky. Already the surface is receding, dimming, and you are sinking into that spiral. If you're lucky, you'll brush the sanded bottom, slice a heel on a mussel shell, kick for oxygen. The trail of blood behind you dispersing into the blue. I'll read two more poems. I was tickled that a number of people from the States joined us tonight and read so well. By the way, thank you to everyone who read in the open mic. I was particularly thrilled to finally see one of my students, Jesse McPherson, whom I've worked with on the phone, but never actually seen him in the flesh. And of course, Douglas Harasmiak, great to see you again as well too. This is called Florida. There's a section in this book on America, which has always been a subject of fascination to me long before it became, all we could talk about the last 4 years. This is called Florida. This is the tropical nightmare glimpsed in newscasts of hurricanes battering the coast. Wild sachet of palms, beach sand flaying the air, rain like a biblical flood from above. Zigzag of mosquitoes, humidity so dense and moisture-laden, your feet squelch in your sandals. Wisconsin weather at Florida prices, grumbles a man in Hawaiian shorts. Lightning splices the sky and geckos flee across the sidewalk. Your body becomes a swamp, sodden with sweat, infested. Scarlet fungus snates around your torso. But later, you'll miss the little white studio with its filthy floors, the clatter of ceiling fans, the woman in the next apartment who warbled in Spanish. It sounded like one long lamentation, a ceaseless complaint, then the sudden, sweet shout of her orgasm. You'll remember the pink hibiscus, the green parrot perched atop green coconuts. Even if you never saw a manatee or a crocodile, you saw grackles blackening the power lines in parking lots at sunset. The intricate structures of a banyan tree, its roots and branches, a complicated city, 100 years old, destined to live 1,000. So I'll finish with this poem from the last section. It's called You Are Here. And I was thinking about, I guess some of the new age kind of sayings that are so common these days, and how part of our work as a poet sometimes is simply doing as little as possible and just paying attention to small things, and how something that can look like sloth to other people is really actually can be the hardest work of all. So you are here. This is a day of deliberate sloth, and who knew? You are actually not that good at doing nothing. There's only so much attention one can pay to taste everything, to feel everything, to live in the moment. It's a sort of curse. To be that sensitive, a form of torture, like having your skin scraped by a potato grater. What did people do before distraction saved them from contemplation? Scanned the surface of the pond for a flicker of anything to skim the surface. Water strider, lotus bud, dead leaf. You try to want what you have, but like everyone else, whine and complain. Temperature never in that narrow range of just right. And today it's raining. Blue-gray sky like a wet stone, sleet against the windows. If only you were more monk-like, then you wouldn't eat chocolate caramels all afternoon, or own 30 dresses, or covet your neighbor's counters and floors. You would bless the panhandler who called you a chink instead of telling her to go kill herself. You would simply let it go. Instead of rage and regret trailing you into the next life, like the paper Mercedes and mansions Chinese mourners burn for their beloveds, so they'll be saddled with material even in the ether. Today, you are here, swaddled in blankets, no heat, because instead of day labor, you stare into space, waiting for a metaphor. The cold inks your fingertips indigo, like a criminal's. What kind of artist would you be if you couldn't see your breath inside your own home?
I have a question for you. One thing that I've been thinking about is the city has changed so much in my time here, like what, 23 years, 24 years. And it's just been such a change from, it used to have a little bit of a small town feel. And I guess it kind of still does, but it's just all these high rises. And you mentioned the needles and all that stuff, which were around back then. But how has that affected your writing besides just your differences in moods? Has that changed your mood or your writing at all, just the environment that Vancouver has become?
I think when I first began writing, particularly short stories and my earlier poems, I was quite intent on not having Vancouver be a character, because I like the idea of existing in a sort of floating world. I guess like some Japanese literature refers to. I think when you name a city, it can really nail things down. I mean, the reader immediately brings to that piece of writing their own preconceptions of that place and their own pictures of that place. But even without naming the city, it was still seeping into the work, right? Through the weather, through, the glass towers, whatever. And so, I mean, the gloss that the city has painted on it now, I think whether or not I'm conscious of it, that has to somehow kind of infuse one's work. So it may not be something I'm writing about in a sort of a dedicated, deliberate way, but I think the atmosphere that you're surrounded by and your physical setting is going to find its way in one way or another into your work. So I think there's a kind of, there's a sort of maybe an earnestness that Vancouver had that has been lost, right? In the kind of the polish and I guess the superficiality of it now. But at the same time, there is so much beauty, and that beauty is something that, I certainly pay attention to every day.
I wanted to mention some about your November poem. I was thinking, it does, like I see it in my work, lots of people get very sad during November. It causes all these things. I was like, man, you have Halloween, where, you know, you think about the dead, then you have Remembrance Day, and then you have everything dying all around you. Then it's just dark, and no wonder it's depressing. There's like, you can't escape it. So what do you do to escape, you know, those moments, or, you know, days of sadness, or what do you do? Is it just writing and contemplating?
Well, I've discovered a guilty pleasure, which is reading thrillers in bed under a big duvet with my herbal tea and my snacks beside me. It's very, very comforting. So sometimes, you know, this task that we poets have of thinking deep thoughts, we just need a reprieve from it, right? So escaping into another world through fiction rather than, you know, the kind of really intense attention that I bring to reading other people's poetry. I can just kind of put that on hold and just dive into the sort of book that actually, you know, makes it onto the bestseller list and people who don't read will read, right? So I've discovered that's a pleasure that is, you know, is not to be taken too lightly. But it's interesting. I think every poet has a November poem, right? I mean, living here on the West Coast, it's
Mhm.
definitely that early darkness is not conducive to a cheery mood.
No, no.
How
Uh,
do you counteract
uh,
November?
what do I do? I like say, I've been jumping in the ocean.
Oh
Um,
my God. Are you
yeah,
doing that Win Hof method thing of
yeah. Okay. I wouldn't say I'm Win Hoffing, but I try and I started doing it, and it's something that makes me feel good afterwards. So that's one thing. And of course, getting some time to write is good. Thanks for your question, Evelyn. I got some more questions for you, though. Um, Someone's asking, uh, how does US figure in your floating world? How does the US figure in your
uh, um that's a very interesting question. I have been, I think okay, my travel ambition, everybody has a travel ambition, right? And for most people, it's Europe, it's Asia. And for me, you know, as long as I can remember, it has been visiting all the American states. That has been my travel ambition. Um, and I've done maybe, I think, about 30 now, and probably will never make it to all of them, you know, given the pandemic has put everything on hold. But coming back with a poem, with at least one poem from every state. So definitely in my travels in the States, I have been much more interested in anchoring poetry in the individual places I have gone to,
Mhm.
as opposed to necessarily writing about Vancouver and its specific neighborhoods. So, you know, maybe again, that's partly the um, the inspiration of travel is that you do look at place as a character in the way you may not your own hometown,
Mhm.
particularly the one you've lived in your whole life. So there's something about too, you know, being kind of an outsider in certain places and writing from that perspective of being outside and yet not entirely dissimilar. You know, Canada, US is, you know, there are a lot of similarities as well too. That gives you an interesting perspective.
Mhm. Uh, Thanks for the answer. I'd like to hear more another time about what your favorite places are, but I'm interested also. Shulamit asks, can you speak a little about your minimalist attitude, doing as little as possible?
Oh, you know, I sometimes feel as a poet that we always feel we need to justify our work in a way that novelists don't have to. I mean, all you have to do is say you're working on a novel, and people look at you with respect, and they immediately think that, you know, it's important to leave you alone because you're doing, you know, important work and difficult work. And yet, the work of a poet is not often given that same weight. And it's not about how many pages you produce in a day. It's not about, you know, I'm going to sit down every morning and write 500 words between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock. And because it doesn't lend itself to that sort of discipline, I think sometimes people think there isn't a discipline in poetry, when in fact there is so much more, because you're limited to those few words on the page. And so those few words have to be exactly right. You're always paring down draft after draft to find those words that are as close to the words, you know, or the image that you have in your mind. So it's a difficult, you know, I'm saddened that that there's almost like this feeling of apology if you say that you write poetry or that you are a poet, that it isn't given, that the work that goes into poetry is not given that same, you know, respect. But in order to find, yeah, that minimalist, I mean, I guess it's like anything, you know, whether you're curating, I don't know, the clothes in your closet or, you know, the furniture in your home, you know, paring it down to the fewest possible items, the fewest possible words that are the right words or the right items is such a difficult and demanding thing to do. But if you get it right, you know, then that's what you're aiming for, right?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to say how everyone's work tonight has been very important to me, and like your work is important to me much more than all the books in Costco combined. Like that's my gold, you know. Poetry is my gold, and I think everyone who's here tonight feels the same. And but it's like this kind of secret cult, you know, like no one really talks about it. You sometimes you'll meet someone, you're like, I like poetry. What, you like poetry? Who do you like? And they mention someone, whoa, what the heck? You know, it's so important. And anyways, you said it better than I.
Well, no, I think one thing that I love about readers of poetry is that we don't read lightly, you know, it's not sort of the latest fad or the latest, you know, it's kind of it's separate from all of those fashions. And when we read with great care, and we can often remember lines, if not, you know, whole passages or whole poems that are meaningful to us. And they accompany us the way that maybe song lyrics do to teenagers, right? I mean, they're knit into us. I mean, I can't tell you how often I'm walking down the street or I'm looking at something and a line from someone's poem will pop into my head, and it'll just be the most perfect, interesting juxtaposition to what I'm doing or what I'm looking at. So I think the fact that none of us read poetry casually, I mean, like we do it, it is of such importance to us that I think that's, even though we feel as poets, our readers are few, we value them so much more because we know how much attention they pay to our work.
Mm-hmm. Also, you can get one line of poetry and be like, oh, I'm good. I read that. I'm fine now. Or you could read a whole book and just be like, yeah. Anyways, I have a couple more questions if you don't mind. Just someone, I think Nefertiti was asking about any Japanese work or authors that you're particularly interested in when you think about the floating world versus Vancouver and stuff.
Back in the day, Mishima, of course, I think was quite an influence. I was lucky enough to go to Japan once on a book tour, actually, and was fascinated by Tokyo. I wish I could think of names. I'm getting to that point where names are escaping me. But I think one of the things I was drawn to with Japanese literature is the minimalism, even in, you know, say novellas, for example, likewise with French novellas. That very poetic sort of bringing things down to their essence, even in prose. And one of the things I like to do as a reader of poetry is, when we were talking a little bit earlier about attention, is if I'm particularly struck by a passage or a poem and I'm curious as to thinking that has gone into it. I will write it out by hand, someone else's poem. And in so doing, it actually makes me almost, I feel like I'm thinking the way that the poet might be thinking at the time that they were writing that poem. And I can have a better insight into maybe why they broke a line a certain way, or why they chose a certain word or image or punctuation. So I think that kind of level of bringing that sort of attention to reading poetry is also really helpful to really embody somebody's work.
Okay, so reading poetry, writing the lines, and getting that feeling has really helped you.
Sort of genuinely studying it.